Hi, everyone. Welcome back to English Class Collective. I'm Alex, and with me today is my co host, Lucas.
Hello, everyone. I'm really excited about today's episode because we're going to talk about something that happens to all of us embarrassing English mistakes.
Oh, yes, and trust me, we've got some funny stories to share. Even native English speakers make mistakes sometimes, so it's completely normal for English learners to have these moments too.
Absolutely. In today's episode, we will discuss common mistakes that can lead to funny or awkward situations. But don't worry, we're here to help you avoid these mistakes and feel more confident when speaking English.
Let's start with one of the most common mix ups that English learners face. One of the most confusing things for English learners is when words sound similar but have very different meanings. I remember one of my students once told me she was embracing when she meant she was embarrassed.
Oh no, that's a classic one. And you know what? It's totally understandable because these words do sound similar. Another common mistake I've noticed is when people mix up exciting and excited.
Yes, like saying, I am exciting to meet you instead of I am excited to meet you. That can create some funny situations.
Speaking of funny situations, I had a student who wanted to tell his classmate that he was hungry, but he kept saying he was angry. Everyone was a bit confused about why he was so upset.
That's hilarious. Here's a practical tip for our listeners. When you learn a new word, try to learn its common partners too. Like with make and do, we make breakfast, but we do homework.
That's a great tip, Alex. Another tricky area is false friends. Words that look similar in different languages but mean something completely different in English.
Oh, yes, like how actually in English means in fact or really, but in some languages, similar looking words mean currently or now. I've seen this cause some confusion.
And let's not forget about pronunciation mistakes that can lead to funny situations, like the difference between sheet and, well, you know what I mean.
Maybe we should keep that one a mystery for our listeners. But you're right, pronunciation is really important. I always tell my students to practice the difference between similar sounds, like beach and pitch.
Another tip I give my students is to learn full phrases instead of just single words. It helps avoid those awkward moments when you directly translate from your native language.
Absolutely. Like, instead of saying I am with hunger, which might be correct in some languages, in English we simply say I am hungry.
These little differences can really change the meaning of what we're trying to say. But remember, listeners, it's completely normal to make these mistakes when you're learning.
All right, let's review some of the key vocabulary and expressions we just discussed. First, we have embarrassed versus embracing. Remember, to be embarrassed means to feel awkward or ashamed.
Here's an example. I was so embarrassed when I fell in front of everyone.
The next pair is excited versus exciting. When something is exciting, it causes excitement. But when you are excited, you feel the excitement.
Like in this example, the movie was exciting, and I was excited to watch it.
We also talked about false friends. These are words that look similar in different languages, but have different meanings.
Next up is the difference between make and do. We make food, make plans, and make decisions.
But we do homework, do exercise, and do housework. It's a tricky one.
And finally, let's remember that important phrase structure. I am hungry, instead of translating directly from other languages.
Right. This is much better than saying I am with hunger or I have hunger. Now, let's check how well you understood the first part of our conversation. Here's question number 1. What's the difference between excited and exciting?
Take a moment to think about your answer. You can pause the podcast right now if you'd like.
Ready for the answer? Excited is how you feel, while exciting describes something that causes excitement.
Here's question number 2. Can you name 2 things we typically use with the verb make and 2 things we use with do?
Go ahead and pause if you need more time to think about it.
Here's the answer. We make food and make plans, but we do homework and do exercise.
Great job if you got these right. Don't worry if you didn't. Learning takes time and practice. Lucas, I've been thinking about how different cultures approach making mistakes when speaking English. It's fascinating, really.
Oh, that's an interesting point. What have you noticed in your experience teaching English?
Well, I've noticed that some of my students from East Asian countries often apologize a lot for their mistakes, even when they're speaking quite well. They seem really concerned about being perfect.
That's true. And I've had the opposite experience with some of my Brazilian students. They tend to be much more relaxed about making mistakes and just keep talking.
Exactly. It really shows how our cultural background can affect our language learning journey. I remember when I was learning Spanish, I was so worried about using the wrong verb tense.
That reminds me of my experience learning Japanese. I was terrified of using the wrong level of politeness and potentially offending someone. I actually stayed quiet in many situations because of that fear.
That's such a common experience. But you know what I've learned from teaching? Making mistakes is actually one of the best ways to learn.
Absolutely. I always tell my students that every successful language learner has made thousands of mistakes along the way. It's part of the process.
And there's something really powerful about embracing those mistakes. I had a student from Vietnam who used to be so shy about speaking, but once she started viewing mistakes as learning opportunities, her English improved dramatically.
That's amazing. I've seen similar transformations. You know what's interesting? In some cultures, people tend to correct each other's mistakes directly, while in others, it's considered rude.
Yes, like in some European countries, immediate correction is quite common and accepted, but in other places, people prefer indirect feedback or no correction at all.
I think it's so important for our listeners to understand that there's no right way to handle mistakes. It's about finding what works for you while being respectful of local customs.
And remember, even native English speakers make mistakes all the time. We just tend to be more forgiving of ourselves. Now, let's review some of the important words and expressions we used in our discussion about cultural differences in language learning.
Let's start with approach, as in how different cultures approach making mistakes. This means the way different cultures deal with or handle something.
Right. Here's another example. Many teachers approach teaching grammar in different ways.
Next, we have the phrase cultural background. This refers to the traditions, beliefs, and experiences from the culture you grew up in.
For example, my cultural background influences how I interact with others.
We also use the expression viewing something as, like when we said viewing mistakes as learning opportunities. This means seeing or considering something in a particular way.
Here's how you could use it. Instead of viewing English as difficult, try viewing it as an exciting challenge.
Don't forget the phrase to embrace, as in embracing those mistakes. It means to accept something willingly or enthusiastically.
Like, she learned to embrace the challenges of living in a new country.
Finally, let's look at the expression what works for you, meaning finding the method or approach that's most effective for your personal situation.
For instance, some people learn best by reading, others by listening. You need to find what works for you. Now, let's check your understanding of our discussion about cultural perspectives on language mistakes. Get ready to pause the podcast if you need more time to think about your answers.
Here's question number 1. What did we say was one major difference between Eastern and Western cultures when it comes to making mistakes in language learning?
Pause the podcast now to think about your answer. Ready? The answer is that Eastern cultures often view mistakes as something embarrassing and try to avoid them, while Western cultures typically see mistakes as natural parts of learning.
Here's question number 2. According to our discussion, why is it important to understand different cultural approaches to making mistakes?
Take a moment to think about your answer. And the answer is, understanding different cultural approaches helps us be more empathetic language learners and teachers and allows us to find the best learning strategy that matches our own cultural comfort level. Well, everyone, we've covered quite a bit today about embarrassing English mistakes and how different cultures approach them.
That's right. Remember, the key takeaway is that making mistakes is a natural and important part of learning English. Everyone goes through it, even native speakers sometimes.
We learned about some common mistakes like mixing up embarrassed and embarrassed, and how words like actually and eventually can trick many learners.
And don't forget our discussion about cultural perspectives. Whether you come from a culture that's more focused on perfection or one that's more comfortable with trial and error, there's no wrong way to learn English.
The most important thing is to keep practicing and not let the fear of making mistakes hold you back.
Exactly. We'd love to hear about your experiences too. Have you ever made a funny English mistake? Or do you have a strategy for dealing with language errors?
Share your stories in the comments section below. Your experience might help other learners feel more confident about their journey.